Welcome to the program today. Mondo Gonzales here in studio, but I have through Skype Dr. Titus Kennedy, who is an archaeologist, and we've interviewed him before, but he's got some new stuff coming out. We wanted to talk about really the city of Jericho, which is pretty amazing, certainly in the Bible. You can read about it in the book of Joshua, and a lot has been happening there. Welcome, Dr. Kennedy.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, so, for our audience, we've talked before, but we're getting new people all the time. Kind of give a little background about yourself, even some of the books that you've written. You've written some books on the Gospels and archaeology, and kind of give them a synopsis.
Sure. I'm an archaeologist, and I specialize in biblical archaeology. I'm out in the field doing surveys and excavations, not just a historian or not an armchair archaeologist, as the term gets thrown around. And I've been on 18 different archaeological projects over my career for the last 22 years about now. And I am also writing articles and books. Of course, one of the things we're going to be discussing today is an article that I recently published on the Archeology of Jericho, but also published some books on biblical archaeology, including Unearthing the Bible, Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, and my newest one that will be coming out soon is The Essential Archaeological Guide to Bible Lands. So my main area of interest really is this sort of late Bronze Age, or we might call it the Moses, Joshua, Judges period, and then also the time of the Romans, Jesus, the New Testament period.
So, the late Bronze Age, for people that might not know, what are the time frames we're talking about? Like years?
Well, depending on which publication you go to, it's either going to be about 1550 to 1200 BC, or sometimes 1500 to 1200 BC. Some push it even a little bit later, past 1200 into around 1150 BC. It just depends on the site. It's not a hard date in reality, but of course it's useful to keep those hard dates as a chronological reference.
That is helpful. What I find interesting here, so let's bring it back to the biblical context, is for those listening, the Bible has a lot of detail as it relates to the Israelites coming across the Jordan River, coming west from the east side of the Jordan River. God parts the waters. They come across, and of course, they come to one of the biggest cities at the time. They're right not too far from the Jordan River itself, the city of Jericho. Give a little history. What do we find, or what do we know about Jericho, at least maybe from the Bible? Again, small city, big city. What are the kind of demographics as well as the size of the place?
Well, Jericho doesn't pop up in any of the biblical narratives until this time of Moses and Joshua, just before the entrance into the land of Canaan. It's first mentioned in Numbers 22 during the wandering period. So we don't have any information about it in the Bible prior to that. Jericho is located at a site called Tel Es Sultan, which is in or on the edge of the modern town of Jericho today. And archaeologically, this site is sort of isolated in that during the Bronze Age, there are no other major cities, other major sites anywhere near it. This is actually one of the things that helps us to be sure of its identification, because there are just no other candidates for Jericho in that area. But no archaeologist disputes that Tel Es Sultan is Jericho, or Old Testament Jericho. This site has been excavated for more than a century, not continuously, but off and on. So the first excavations there were actually undertaken way back in 1868. Charles Warren did some exploration there, but he didn't really think that it had anything significant, and he didn't understand some of what was there. Had another brief excavation in 1894 by Bliss, but then the first major expedition came just before World War I. There was an Austro-German expedition, 1907 to 1911, off and on, and they dug up a huge part of the site. In fact, the photographs that we have from that expedition are extremely useful because you can see the remains of the ancient city so well before they become dilapidated by time or in some cases dug through. And they published their findings quite extensively. So we have at least photographs and drawings and some artifacts we can go back and look at. So it's useful in that regard, but archaeology wasn't as developed at the beginning of the 20th century as it was a bit later. So pottery chronology had not been determined yet, and they ultimately concluded that the site was destroyed in about 1600 BC. So if we're looking at a biblical correlation to Joshua and Jericho, then what they found doesn't really fit. Almost 20 years later, Garstang.
So hold on a bit. I find that interesting. So here we are early. What led them to a 1600 BC date? I mean, especially early on, they weren't contaminated by any other thoughts. What kind of led them there to that date?
Basically, the artifacts that they were uncovering, they thought that chronologically some of this material dated much earlier, and they're only able to go off of forms. What was the style of things, and pottery forms especially, and try to correlate that to other archaeological projects. But they never found any kind of inscriptional evidence in their excavations that would point to a more definitive date, which changed when Garstang went there and excavated starting in 1930, because in addition to a lot of pottery, of course, which was more, the pottery chronology was more developed by that time, he also found Egyptian scarabs with the name of kings or pharaohs on them.
Which to me, as always, any sort of scientific discipline is early on, the more collective, the cumulative information that's going to happen is going to help shape things. I mean, certainly early ceramic ideas, and biology is the same way. You get more information, you're like, oh, well, you know what? We didn't have a context, and now we do. So that helps clarify what works and what doesn't.
Sure. Petrie was working on a pottery chronology very early, but that had to be refined and modified over time. And Garstang was actually one of the three major figures who developed the pottery chronology for the Middle East that is still used today.
Wow. So after Garstang, then, kind of give us a history up to what's been happening to today.
So Garstang excavated there from 30 to 36 and also uncovered quite a bit, which we can get into more detail later. But then Kenyon came along to sort of check his work, 1952 to 1958, and her conclusions are what has stuck in academia since then. She differed with Garstang, and she said that the site was destroyed earlier than he did. She put it about 1550 BC, and she linked it to either an Egyptian campaign coming into the Levant or to the Hyksos after being pushed out of Egypt. And unfortunately, Kenyon basically published her conclusions, but not the excavation reports. Those didn't come out until after her death, almost 30 years after the excavations. So people couldn't really check in detail the claims that she was making until much later. And by then it was already assumed fact. And so hardly anyone even bothered to go and look. In 92, there was a very brief excavation, Shimon Ricklin, and then we have the Italian-Palestinian project that started in 97 and has been off and on for many years now. And so they're continuing excavation work and some restoration work as well.
What is the debate now between the early date and the late day of the Exodus, and how does it? Certainly, Jericho has a part to play because it's the first site that really is conquered.
Yeah, so Jericho, I think, is crucial to that discussion because, as you said, Jericho is the first site that gets this massive fire destruction and conquered. And so we should be able to correlate something archaeologically to this event that's recorded in the Joshua narrative if it's historical. So the two main dates for the conquest of Jericho would be either about 1400 BC or in the late 13th century BC. Now, some actually push the Exodus conquest into the 12th century BC, but that's not quite as widely discussed. So if we look at Jericho and we uncover a destruction layer of this final Bronze Age city, then it can point to one of those two dates, or it could point to something else, and it should help us unravel that.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the data, and then as you weave it, you can maybe give some. Well, here's the data, but this is how the people are addressing it. Whether we talk about the ceramics or the scarabs or the clay tablets or the other stuff that's been discovered there, that helps kind of elucidate or influence some of the chronology. Let's talk about that. Just whatever you've seen there, because I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. You just came out with a new report. Maybe talk about your new journal article, and then how you discuss these things.
Sure. So this new journal article is looking at, or maybe reevaluating and bringing up to date, the archaeology of the final Bronze Age destruction of Jericho, and also looking at the correlations to the Joshua narrative and what the archaeological data suggests for the date of that destruction. There's no debate that there's a massive fiery destruction there. And then, in fact, many of the ways in which that city fell correlate to the Joshua narrative. So the dispute is actually more centered around exactly when that happened. So first, I give kind of an introduction to the site of Jericho and just let people know that the location of the site, the identification of the site, is not at all in dispute. So there's no problem of us trying to figure out where Jericho is. And then I talk about some of the basic views of Jericho and the conquest and Joshua. And then I get into some of the correlations between what's written about in Joshua in terms of the city itself and how it falls, and what's found archaeologically. And then I go to a discussion of the timing or the chronology of that destruction at Joshua.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what it comes down to, and I know that there's certainly been a lot of work on it. So, in general, what I find interesting, I was there in Israel in March, and I took the group to Jericho because let's talk a little bit about the stone retaining wall that's there, as well as what they have found with the mud brick wall that's on top, and which correlates very well with what the biblical book of Joshua says. But is there any dispute about that evidence? I mean, talk about how the wall's falling down, like the Bible says, and how do maybe some of those that are skeptics, how do they address it? Do they just simply throw it into another century and they just dismiss it that way, or do they deny the reality of a wall falling down?
There's actually kind of two answers to that. So I'll start by describing this wall. So the wall that we're talking about, according to the most recent excavations, was built or reconstructed in Middle Bronze Age 3. So this is the end of the Middle Bronze Age, right before the Late Bronze Age. You remember we were talking about the Late Bronze Age would be the timing of Joshua. So that wall was built before Joshua, and this wall was constructed by using a stone retaining wall that went around the mound of Jericho, and then on top of that stone retaining wall was a city wall made out of mud brick. So the stone retaining wall itself is about 4 to 5 meters high. It varies depending on exactly where you are on the site. And then the mud brick city wall on top of that, we can't say for certain exactly how high it was, but it was somewhere between 6 to 8 meters high originally. So very tall. And then it was 2 meters thick. So this is a significant wall. Now, the stone retaining wall is still there, standing today. In fact, there are a few sections of the mud brick wall on the northern side of the site in particular that have some substantial remains. Everywhere else, it is toppled and it's in ruins. So the idea of a wall being there and a wall then crumbling is not something that is really disputed. It's the timing of when did that wall cease to be standing, and secondly, another explanation for the crumbling of the walls or the fallen mud bricks that are in front of the stone retaining wall. Another explanation is that they were put there intentionally as some kind of construction add-on.
None of us were actually there, but that seems less plausible. I mean, in archaeology, we deal with probabilities and plausibility and things that are, generally logically connected based on the evidence. That seems less plausible, doesn't it?
Yeah, because the people at Jericho would have basically knocked down their own wall and then pushed those mud bricks in front of the stone retaining wall, and there's no reason for that at all, unless they wanted people to just walk straight into their city everywhere. It's expending a lot of effort for no benefit. In fact, it's negative. You're losing your defenses.
Yeah, I think that one of the amazing things that people need to understand is oftentimes when we think, oh, the wall fell down, that I know for me early on, before I was really getting into the data, is I was assuming that a stone wall, that a stone with bricks, stone, that you see around the land of Israel or whatever, that the stone wall actually fell. Well, the Bible doesn't say that, but it makes great sense that it just says the wall, but we tend to, maybe at least I did, misunderstand that. But when we see the stone wall still being there, it's tremendous. You go there it is. But also the idea of the mud brick wall providing a significant level of defense, especially at that time frame. And then that being probably a little bit more possible for that to come apart versus a stone with an earthquake. Maybe talk about some of the mechanisms that are possible for how that wall came down.
Well, the two most likely ways for that wall to come down is that it happened through some kind of earthquake type event, right? So it's either a phenomenon that occurs through those means or people intentionally destroyed it. Now, why earlier excavators, like those looking at the Kenyan excavations, why scholars attributed an earthquake to the falling of that wall is for two reasons. First of all, Jericho is in an earthquake zone. There have been many major earthquakes around Jericho over the centuries. Some in recent history, and they were incredibly destructive. Some in very ancient history. There was an early Bronze Age earthquake at Jericho, at least from what we can tell, and it destroyed the city. So that's why they would associate the falling of the wall with a possible earthquake or something like that. As far as people doing it intentionally, well, if there was an army that came and attacked Jericho and wanted to destroy the city or break in and defeat the city, then they would have to get through the walls. The problem with that scenario is that first of all, there's no reason for them to destroy the walls all around the site. That's a huge amount of effort. It's unnecessary. But secondly, the walls wouldn't fall outside of the city if they were doing that. They would use some type of battering or a siege tower instead. So it doesn't really fit well with the method of warfare during the Bronze Age. And that's why I find it unlikely that it was, say, the Egyptians or the Hyksos who went there and just smashed the wall.
Yeah, to me, as you said, they're going to be pounding on these walls from the outside, and most likely they would fall inward. But what we see there is these walls falling outward, and then falling down towards the bottom of the stone wall, which then created. They did, and the Bible says they went up into the city. So maybe at this time, talk about some of the congruences that you mentioned in your article, kind of summarizing them. And you've taken this collective centuries worth of data, you've analyzed it very, very carefully. And what do you see as some of the summaries as it relates to influencing what we understand about the timing and the connections with the biblical narrative?
So first of all, we have a walled city at Jericho. So there is indeed a fortified city. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the walls did collapse. Then third, the walls collapsed in such a way that the mud bricks essentially formed a ramp so that people or attackers outside the city could walk right up into the city. So the defenses were rendered useless, and they all around the city except for on the north, these walls fell down. So that doesn't connect well at all with normal siege warfare of the period. Third, we have the large jars full of burned grain that were found in multiple locations in the city, both by Garstang and Kenyon. And what that tells us is, first of all, the siege or the fall of Jericho happened sometime after the spring harvest. In fact, we can say that grain was barley. The barley harvest is March, April. So this also doesn't fit with the typical siege warfare of the period. Rather than besieging a city after the harvest, that would be the worst time, you would besiege before so that you could more easily or more quickly starve out the siege population, and you could then harvest the field for your own army and feed your troops there. So that also helps us to see the timing connect, because in Joshua, we know that they attacked Jericho soon after Passover, which is also the spring harvest time. So that kind of timing connects. And then we see in Joshua the command to destroy everything in the city except for the metals, which they were supposed to put into the treasury. And that is contrary to typical military practice also. You would go in and you would loot the city. You would need to feed your own troops. Food wasn't so readily available on military campaigns. It's not so easy to supply troops, especially during the Bronze Age. So these kinds of correlations fit very well. And then we also have the burning of the city after the toppling of the wall, complete burning, massive intentional fire destruction. That's also recorded in Joshua. And then we have the abandonment of the city for centuries, which is also noted in the Bible. So we have a number of different things that are connecting very well in terms of the manner of destruction and the description of the city.
To me, it fits quite nicely. Now, let's talk about, because we want to be fair, in the sense of the data, is there anything that is, super crystal clear that does not follow or does not fit? I'm not talking about silence, but is there anything that contradicts the biblical data that we have?
I would say no, unless you're interpreting some of the chronological data to be in conflict with the biblical narrative in terms of, what year approximately did this happen. Mm-hmm. The manner fits. It fits so well. In fact, it's almost too much of a coincidence if it was a coincidence. All those things that I talked about, in addition to, we could look at Jericho later on in history and the biblical record about Jericho and see how the stratigraphy at the site matches so well. For example, you have the destruction and then this long abandonment. Well, the only time that Jericho is referenced until its rebuilding in the 9th century BC is in Judges 3, where there is a large house, we might call it a palace or something, that Eglon of Moab lives in until he gets assassinated. But there's no city at Jericho. So there's just this house. Well, in Garstang's excavations, he found this residential building, a small palace or villa, you might call it, that was only occupied in the 14th century BC, and he actually connected it with Judges chapter 3. There was no city though at Jericho, just this house. And then in the 9th century, it gets rebuilt, which is referenced also in the Book of Kings. And we have later biblical references to Jericho too, like during the time of the Babylonians, and archaeologically Jericho gets destroyed by the Babylonians during their conquest of the region. So many different correlations there.
So as it relates to like your article, what was kind of your point in coming out writing an article now? What was kind of your conclusion that you were adding? What new did you add to the body of literature that we have?
Well, first of all, most people are incredibly confused about Jericho, and not just the general public, but biblical scholars and historians and even archaeologists and tour guides. People go to Jericho and they have no idea what they're looking at. Tour guides don't even know what to say.
Yeah.
They just take them up on the hill and then tell the story. They can't point to what trench is what and what stratigraphic layer in that trench is what, and discuss the walls and so forth. So I wanted to clear up confusion, but I also wanted to publish an updated article on the archaeology of Jericho as it relates to the book of Joshua, because the last time anything like that was published was in the early 90s, and there have been quite a few seasons of excavations since then, and also a lot of other data that wasn't brought out. There's been some refinement even in the pottery chronology concerning what we might call exotic wares. So I tried to update all this. There have been new radiocarbon studies that have come out and just make it more comprehensive than earlier publications and try to clear things up.
Yeah, to me, two things. When I was there, just recently, and even a few years ago before COVID, I saw the same thing as it relates to some of the tour guides talking about, hey, here's the wall, and like, well, we didn't really know any of this, and I was like, oh yeah, all this is here. Work that has been done, and it's pretty amazing if you can go there and actually say, yeah, there's the stone wall, there's the mud brick, because even some of them, as you said, you can still go there and see the outlines of the mud brick. Some of it's been weathered and eroded, but you can still see the clear outlines of many of them. I wish they would kind of protect it better, but it is what it is. The second thing too is I think your article was great in bringing it up right here to the current date, summarizing it, which was awesome. I've already sent it off to several of the tour guides to say, hey, you're going to want to see this article to stay up to date on this exact thing, because Jericho is in the Bible, man. It's awesome. It's got such an opportunity to be tested according to the data. For those that the journal article, it's available, it's free, it's out there, right? How do people find it?
Yeah, it's open access online. So it's in the journal called Religions, and you can just search the Bronze Age destruction of Jericho, and you should be able to find it, or I guess you can put a link.
Yeah, we'll put a link in
post. For a while, it was on the front page of the Religions Journal website. I don't know if it still is, but yeah, should be pretty easy to search for. Oh yeah, it's still on the front page there.
Okay. So. Yeah, we'll put a link down there, because I think for those that are interested to see some of the correlations. Again, I know this and you know this, but are archaeologists ever going to have a consensus of 100% on anything?
No, definitely not.
Definitely not. Yeah. So one last question here is, you mentioned in the article a little bit about the different possibilities of, people often ask, okay, they came out of the land during the Exodus, they wander for 40 years, then they come in, as you mentioned, they come into the city of Jericho to conquer it. What's the latest as it relates to who the Pharaoh of the Exodus is? What's your thoughts?
I support the hypothesis that it's Amenhotep II. So I think there's pretty widespread support of that identification for Pharaoh, especially among people who put the Exodus in the 15th century BC. Mm-hmm. And I think there are a lot of compelling reasons, and there have been some articles and some videos that have done a good job summarizing that evidence.
Have you ever done any article on that specifically, or have any intention on it, or it's already been done?
I've written about it in 2 of my books a little bit, just a bit in the first book, and in my most recent upcoming book a little bit more extensively. And I also helped with a video on this topic that Expedition Bible did fairly recently.
Oh, very awesome. Your upcoming book, when's it going to be out?
The very end of the year, or the 1st of January, something like that. I think the 1st of January.
Well, when it comes out, make sure to let us know. We'll have you back, because I appreciate your work, and have all your books sitting right there in my and I know our audience does as well. So, what other any other projects you're working on that you can share? I know sometimes people can't share, but anything that you're working on you want to share?
I am working on a couple of archaeological projects. So one of them is in planning stages for a new excavation, and the other is continuing on. So once I publish that report, or actually I should say once the publication comes out, then I can talk about it a little bit more, but I don't really want to share some of that data before it's actually out and published, just in case people get upset about that.
Yep, that's the world of archaeology. There's always some challenges, but Titus, appreciate your time today. It's been awesome. Appreciate the update. We'll get some links in the description for not only your journal article, but again for your other works. You've written so much, especially on the New Testament as well. It's been awesome.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, for those watching today, I hope you enjoyed this. It's been fun continually looking at the ways in which archaeology helps confirm the reality of Scripture. We know the Bible's true. We take that by faith. We don't have every last answer that we would want, but when we have opportunities to talk to people like Dr. Kennedy here out there in the field doing the work, and to report back to us what they find out there, it's a tremendous blessing and increases my faith. So appreciate you watching. Hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time.